Story 1. There was a time when I lived alone, right after moving out of my parents' house and before I started living with my girlfriend. Back then, I stayed in a small one-bedroom apartment located on the ground floor of a larger house. I spent most of my time alone, except when I was at work or college. To pass the time, I would often watch movies, especially horror films. Even though I was already 21 years old, some scenes still unsettled me when it was time to sleep, especially since I was living alone. Whenever I watched a horror movie, I would get a little paranoid, glancing around my room now and then, sometimes even turning on my bedside lamp just to make sure everything was fine. On that particular night, the tenant from the upstairs unit wasn't home, as his car wasn't in the driveway. So, when I started hearing strange noises, I knew they couldn't be coming from someone upstairs. The tension grew as the sounds repeated. To make matters worse, I couldn't pinpoint where they were coming from. My heart started racing, and my discomfort increased. I decided to get up and walk to my bedroom door. As I opened it, I was met with the narrow hallway leading to the bathroom and living room. But at the end of the hallway, something made me freeze. There was someone standing there. A woman. She was near the kitchen, and the dim moonlight filtering through the windows allowed me to see her silhouette clearly. She stared at me. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, watching. Then, she began moving backward, never breaking eye contact. My instinct was to run. I rushed back into my room, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I waited, expecting to hear footsteps rushing toward me, pounding on my door, but nothing happened. However, a few seconds later, I heard quick footsteps descending the short staircase leading to the apartment's exit. Then, the front door slammed shut. I stood frozen in fear for several minutes before I finally built up the courage to grab my phone and step out of my room. The apartment was small. There weren't many places someone could hide. I searched quickly, but found no sign of anyone. I ran to lock the front door, trying to figure out who that woman could have been and how she had even gotten inside. I didn't call the police. To this day, I don't know why. The next day, I told my landlord what had happened. He contacted the upstairs tenant, and what I found out left me speechless. The woman who had entered my apartment was his ex-girlfriend. She was completely obsessed with him and had found out where he lived. Apparently, she had come looking for him. But somehow, she had entered the wrong part of the house, my apartment. The next day, the upstairs neighbor knocked on my door and apologized for the incident. He didn't share many details, and neither did the landlord. To this day, I wonder what that woman really intended to do that night. Story 2. I never liked my dad's girlfriend. From the beginning, something about her felt off. Her name is Kathy. My dad has been a widower since my mom passed away in 2019, and ever since then, he seems willing to settle for any company, even hers. Despite my warnings, he never listened to me. I started noticing some strange behavior from her, and it's becoming more and more concerning. To make sense of everything, I need to start from the beginning. I have 2 younger brothers, Jake, who is 10 years old, and Scotty, who is only 2. From the moment my dad introduced us to Kathy, I had a weird feeling. Her smile was too wide, almost unnatural, and it made me uneasy right away. Over time, she started coming to our house more frequently. And, honestly, I could never bring myself to like her. At first, it was just a gut feeling, an unsettling sense that something wasn't right about her personality. But then, strange things started happening. She began spending more time alone in the house. A few weeks ago, I came home and saw her inside my dad's closet. My dad wasn't home at the time. That closet is where he keeps valuable items, including a safe and some important documents. When Kathy noticed me standing there, she simply flashed a weird smile and said, in an overly sweet. A few days later, while my dad was at work again, I came home from school and was heading up the stairs to my room when I noticed Kathy stepping out of my younger brother Jake's room. She calmly shut the door behind her. Curious, I asked what she was doing in there. She gave me a smile and replied, "I just opened the window. It was really hot in here." I didn't say anything and continued walking to my room. I waited for her to go downstairs, listening to her footsteps fading away, and then quietly made my way to Jake's room to check if she had actually opened the window. Both windows were shut. At that moment, I knew for sure that something was off about this woman. And to this day, I still feel the same way. Later, I told my dad again, but he only asked me to be patient. He said he understood that I didn't like Kathy, but he wanted me to try and accept her. I didn't mention anything to Jake. 2 days ago, my dad, Jake, and I were all out of the house, and Kathy was left in charge of looking after my youngest brother, Scotty. I arrived home unexpectedly, without letting anyone know I was coming. I wanted to observe her, without her realizing, hoping to catch her in something suspicious. I entered the house silently and went straight to my room. That's when I heard something coming from the kitchen downstairs. It was Scotty crying. But it wasn't just normal crying, it was a desperate, terrified cry. Then, I heard Kathy yelling at the top of her lungs, telling him to shut up. It was the first time I had heard her lose her temper, and at that moment, I realized her true nature was showing. I ran downstairs, shouting at her to leave my brother alone. She was startled when she saw me there. For the first time, she didn't put on her usual creepy smile. Instead, she just stared at me blankly without saying a word. Then, she turned away and went down into the basement, closing the door behind her. I immediately grabbed my phone and called my dad, telling him everything that had happened. That night, he had a conversation with Kathy about it. I don't know how it went, but I doubt it ended well, because something strange happened afterward. In the middle of the night, I woke up with an overwhelming feeling that something was wrong. I looked around my room and saw a silhouette standing there. There was someone in my room. Before I could react, the figure quickly moved and shut the door behind them. I jumped out of bed and ran to open my door. As soon as I stepped into the hallway, I saw my dad's bedroom door closing. I walked over, opened the door, and found my dad and Kathy lying in bed. Furious, I shook my dad awake and told him that Kathy had just been in my room. She denied everything, claiming she had been in bed the entire time. I don't know if my dad believed me, but he just told me to go back to my room, assuring me that he would talk to her. I obeyed, but as I closed my door, I could hear them whispering in the other room. I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I still can't. I want this woman out of our house, out of our lives. I'm convinced she's dangerous. What was she doing in my room? It's driving me insane. I'm worried about my family's safety, and I have no idea what to do about it. Story 3. This happened a few years ago when I was 30 years old. At the time, I was staying at my apartment in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The condo I still live in today is on the second floor of a relatively upscale building, the name of which I prefer not to disclose for privacy reasons. Whenever I get the chance, I escape there during the colder months up north. Since I work remotely, I can spend a good amount of time at the place. Fort Lauderdale is, for the most part, a clean and safe city. My building is in a peaceful neighborhood, with no history of issues. It was January, a warm night a little past 10 o'clock, and I was sitting on my balcony with my feet up on the railing, working on my laptop. That's when I heard someone shouting from down below, "Hey." At first, I ignored it, assuming they were calling out to someone else. But then, I heard it again. "Hey, you up there." My heart skipped a beat. This time, I knew they were talking to me. My first thought was, why? I closed my laptop, stood up, and looked over the railing. Down in the parking lot, a man was standing next to a car. He was staring straight at me. "Yes, you," he repeated. I asked what was going on. He responded, "Come down here. I want to show you something cool." Now, paying closer attention, I took a better look at him. He was wearing a backward cap and a tank top. At first, I figured he was just some punk kid messing with me. So, I ignored him and sat back down. The moment I did that, I heard the man below laughing. Then he shouted, "I'm coming up there to skin you alive, you idiot." I stood up again and looked down at him. This time, I noticed something I hadn't before. He was older than I initially thought. He definitely wasn't some kid. I opened my mouth to shout something back at him, but for some reason, I stopped myself. Instead, I grabbed my laptop and stepped inside, firmly sliding the balcony door shut. I expected him to keep yelling threats or insults, but surprisingly, everything went silent. Despite how uneasy I felt, Being inside made me feel much safer. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just another drugged-up lunatic wandering the streets of Florida. But then, things escalated to an entirely different level. The silence inside my apartment was shattered by violent pounding on my front door. Along with the banging came the same voice, now screaming profanities and explicit threats. It was him again. The hits were so forceful that, for a moment, I genuinely believed he was going to break down the door. The only thing I could do was yell, "I'm calling the police." But that didn't stop him. In fact, the banging only intensified, as if he was even more determined to get inside. Then, the sound changed. The dull thuds of fists hitting were replaced by something much worse, a sharp, cutting noise, like something stabbing into the door. My blood ran cold. He was stabbing my door. The whole ordeal probably lasted only a couple of minutes, but to me, it felt like an eternity. Finally, after one last brutal strike, he let out another hateful scream and vanished. I stood there, listening intently for any sign that he was still nearby. When I felt it was safe, I slowly approached the door and looked through the peephole. He was really gone. As soon as I managed to calm myself down, I called the police. When the officers arrived, I showed them the door. On the outside, there were deep slashes and punctures, confirming what I had heard. That man had, without a doubt, been armed with a knife. The police documented the incident and searched the area, but they couldn't find him. That night, all I could do was pray that no one else got hurt. To this day, I don't believe he knew me. I think he was just a completely deranged man looking for someone to harm. Story 4. I spent a night in jail once. And as cliche as it sounds, I really didn't do anything wrong. It all started when I was assaulted by a nightclub bouncer in my hometown. It happened because a girl I had been involved with in the past decided to fabricate a ridiculous lie, telling the bouncer that I had been harassing her and her friends. I hadn't even spoken to them, but the bouncer believed her. Without hesitation, he stormed up to me and started shoving me out of the club. At that moment, I was drunk and, instinctively, I pushed back. And of course, as luck would have it, there were cops right outside the club. Between a drunk guy and a club bouncer, who do you think they sided with? I ended up handcuffed and thrown into the back of a police car. I spent the night at the station, locked in a small, uncomfortable cell. The only thing in there was a wooden bench to sit on. And I wasn't alone. There was another guy in the cell with me. He looked over at me and asked, "What are you in for?" I told him exactly what had happened. He just smirked and nodded. That was when I realized I did not belong there. The guy had tattoos all over his face. He was missing a front tooth, and his stare sent a clear message: don't mess with me. Not wanting to start any trouble, I decided to only talk if he spoke to me first. As time passed, I found myself venting out of sheer frustration. I mentioned that I lived in an upper-class neighborhood. I told him I had friends over that night since my parents were out of town. Basically, I ended up narrating my entire night. Maybe because I was drunk. Maybe because I just wanted to talk to someone. I just wanted to sleep, but he kept trying to chat with me. At first, I was polite, but after a while, I started getting annoyed. I think he picked up on it because eventually he stopped talking. The next morning, we had to appear in court. Yes, unfortunately, I was charged with assault and trespassing. 2 completely ridiculous charges. My cellmate also had a hearing, so we were taken together. I was called up first. While I was at the stand, he stayed at the back of the courtroom, listening carefully to the charges against me. After some formalities, I was released with a scheduled court date. At the time, I thought that was the end of it, but I was wrong. That night, back home, I left a few windows open to let in the cool breeze. That's when I heard something outside. Footsteps. More than one person was walking around the house. Immediately, I started closing all the windows on the first floor, one by one. When I reached the sliding glass door leading to the backyard, I acted on instinct. I switched on the patio light, and that's when I saw them. 2 men immediately bolted out of the light and disappeared into the darkness. I recognized one of them. It was my cellmate. My heart pounded in my chest. I yanked the curtains shut and locked the rest of the house as fast as I could. I couldn't believe it. He had found me, and he wasn't alone. Worse still, he knew exactly where I lived. After hearing that my parents were away and that I came for money, he must have seen it as the perfect opportunity. He had probably heard my name in court, looked me up online, and found my address. After the light exposed them, the two men took off. I didn't hear anything else that night. I never told my parents about it. And since I never told them I got arrested, I also never told them that my former cellmate almost robbed our house. Just a few days ago, Spencer and I agreed to make our relationship official as boyfriend and girlfriend. That night, I woke up to a loud noise in my room. I panicked and turned on the bedside lamp. It took me a moment to realize what was missing from the wall. My grandmother's photo. I got up and saw that the frame had fallen on the floor and cracked. My grandmother's picture fell and broke on the same night I agreed to date Spencer. I held the frame in my hands, feeling my heart race. My entire body was trembling. The next day, I called Spencer and told him that I thought we should take a break, as my mind wasn't in the right place. He exploded with anger on the phone. That conversation was proof that my grandmother was right about him. But what about the frame? What made it fall? There was no draft in the room. Still, it fell that very night. Could it have been a sign from my grandmother? Do you realize how terrifying that is? Story 6. This is one of the few unexplainable experiences I've had in my life. I was at home in my room writing a paper for my history class. As far as I knew, I was alone at home. But apparently I was wrong, because I heard my mom's voice calling me from downstairs. She shouted my name. I called back. What? No response. I sighed, frustrated, because I didn't want to lose my train of thought on my paper. But reluctantly, I got up to see what she wanted. When I reached the downstairs, I looked around, but my mom was nowhere to be seen. I called for her. Mom. She responded, calling my name again. The voice was coming from the basement. I went to the basement door. The lights were off. I called again. Mom. She responded. Why are you down there in the dark? I asked. Silence. I turned on the light and began to descend the stairs. I heard my mom call my name again. Now, I was close to the bottom of the stairs. But something was off. Every time she called my name, the voice sounded identical. The same tone, no variation whatsoever. I called for her again. And once more, she just repeated my name. She wasn't anywhere. That's when I noticed. The small closet door in the basement was open. We always called that space the crawl space, because to get in, you have to crouch down. It took up a large portion of the basement. That was the only place my mom could have been. So I called out one last time. Mom. This time, there was no answer. I moved closer to the closet and knelt down to look inside. Inside, it was pure darkness. The silence was complete, except for the faint buzzing of the basement light. My heart was pounding. Are you messing with me? I asked. No response. My entire body tensed. Suddenly, without thinking, I sprinted back upstairs. I slammed the basement door shut and locked it behind me. I grabbed the phone and called my mom. She answered after a few rings. I asked her where she was. Shopping, she said. I froze. My mom wasn't home. I don't know what I just heard and experienced, but I know I wasn't alone. Story 6. I was about 9 years old when this happened. I was spending the weekend at my grandmother's house, as I often did when I was a child. It was a stormy, rainy day, and my grandmother had gone out to the nearby store to buy ingredients for dinner. I was in the living room watching SpongeBob when the phone rang. There was obviously no reason for me to answer the phone, but being a small child, I did anyway. I went to the kitchen and picked up the receiver. My child's voice said hello. On the other end, a man asked, "Can I speak to the adult in the house?" I answered, "She's not home." The man paused and asked, "So, you're alone right now?" I remember pausing for a moment before responding, "Yes." Even at that age, I realized I probably shouldn't have said that. The man then asked if the address he had on file was correct. But this time, I didn't respond. I simply hung up the phone. Now I was nervous. I worried that I might have put my grandmother in danger. Still, I tried to ignore it and went back to watching SpongeBob. About 20 minutes later, I heard frantic knocks at the door. I muted the TV and listened. Along with the knocks, I heard a man yelling from the other side, "Please, help." I sneaked over to the corner of the wall where I could peek at the front door. I looked through the glass at the top of the door to see who was there. That was a mistake, because the man saw me too. As soon as our eyes met, he said, "Boy, please open the door. I'm badly hurt." I ran to the corner of the room by the window, closed the curtains, and hid behind the sofa. I was terrified. At that time, there were no cell phones, so I couldn't call my grandmother. The man continued knocking at the door, but now his voice had changed. He no longer sounded like he was begging for help. He sounded angry. The knocking became louder and more frequent. Then the sound stopped. For a brief moment, I thought he had left. But then I heard knocks on the window right next to me. My breath caught in my throat. His voice returned. "I'm not going to hurt you, boy. Please, I'm bleeding badly." I curled up in the corner of the room, crying, still hiding behind the sofa. Then, finally, the knocking stopped. I waited a minute, then ran to my grandmother's bedroom and locked the door. I curled up under the blankets, leaving only my head out. The sound of the rain hitting the windowsill and the occasional distant thunder was strangely comforting. For a moment, I felt safer. But then, the man reappeared. I saw his silhouette outside the window. He was trying to open it. Fortunately, all the windows were locked. I curled up completely under the blankets, hoping he wouldn't see me there. And that was the last time I saw or heard him. 20 minutes later, I heard my grandmother walk in through the front door. I ran into her arms, crying and apologizing. I told her everything that had happened. She immediately called the police. When the officers arrived, I had to answer some questions. Afterwards, my grandmother sent me to the guest room to watch TV. Unfortunately, that man was never found. My grandmother never told my parents anything, and she asked me not to tell them either. But after that day, she never left me alone when I stayed at her house, which didn't happen much after that. In summary, one unlocked door and I would have been kidnapped. No doubt about it. Story 7. I am the father of 2 kids. They are 15 and 10 years old. That afternoon, my wife was out of the house. I was taking a nap in my room. My older son is always coming in and out of the house with his friends, so when I heard the front door opening and closing repeatedly, I didn't think much of it. But after the 4th time I heard the door slam, I started to get irritated. I whistled loudly to make him stop with the noise. Then I started hearing other loud noises coming from across the hallway, from the direction of my younger son Keith's room. I thought maybe he was playing with his wrestling toys or something. But even with my door closed, the noise was getting too loud. It was a constant, repetitive sound. It sounded like someone was banging against the wall. What the hell was Keith doing? I got up and went to his room. As I got closer, the sound became clearer. It was the sound of someone literally banging their head against the wall. The door was already open. I went into the room, angry, and called Keith's name. But I didn't see my son. Instead, I saw an adult man facing the wall. He was banging his head against it. There was blood on the wall. The man turned his eyes to me without moving his head. My heart raced, but my reaction was immediate. I ran and tackled the man to the floor. Keith emerged from under the blankets where he had been hiding. The man didn't fight back. He just started yelling nonsense. Keith ran to grab the phone while I kept the man pinned to the floor. I stayed in that position for at least 5 minutes until the police arrived. The man just smiled and laughed, saying things that made no sense. He was either on drugs, insane, or both. I didn't press charges against him, but I'm sure they took him somewhere to get the help he clearly needed. And most importantly, to keep him off the streets. Story 8. I have many night terrors and have had numerous sleep problems. I've experienced sleep paralysis more times than I can count. I've woken up seeing giant spiders and other horrible bugs in my bed, only for them to disappear as I snapped back to reality. And the nightmares are constant. That week, I was overwhelmed with schoolwork. I had many deadlines to meet and stayed up late finishing everything. It was around 3 a.m. when I finally finished. I crashed into bed as soon as my head hit the pillow. And, as usual, I had a bad dream. This time, in the dream, I was trying to escape from a strange, linear building. In the hallways, I found candies, like it was a Halloween haunted house. But I was running from something that was laughing. A child's laughter. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once. Then, I reached a door at the end of the building. The laughter was deafening now. I opened the door and woke up, but I couldn't move. It was sleep paralysis. I heard the laughter again. I looked to the middle of the room. There were 4 people standing there. A man, a woman, a boy, and a girl. They were all holding hands. And they were laughing. Their smiles were impossibly wide. I was frozen. Then, I felt a pressure on my chest. They were getting closer. Finally, my body responded. I threw the covers off and screamed. But when I looked again, they had disappeared, and the laughter had stopped.